In the history of the NBA, Shawn Kemp is remembered not just as a player, but as an explosive phenomenon that redefined the way a power forward could dominate the game with pure power. In the Seattle SuperSonics jersey, he became the soul of one of the most feared teams of the 1990s, teaming up with Gary Payton to form a duo that made the entire league take notice. 6 times selected as an NBA All-Star from 1993 to 1998, 3 times making the All-NBA second team, Kemp was not just a star. He was a symbol of dominance. The peak of his career came when he led the Sonics into the 1996 NBA Finals, going head-to-head with the legend Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls, where he played at a level that the whole world had to acknowledge. Averaging more than 23 points per game against the greatest team of the era, his dunks did not just appear in highlights. They became part of the collective memory of NBA fans. Moments where power, speed, and emotion came together as one, turning him into one of the greatest dunkers of all time. But behind all those titles, those cheers, and that brilliant spotlight was a battle no one in the stands could see. When the arena lights went out, Shawn Kemp was no longer the unbeatable icon. He was a man wrestling with his own life, where personal decisions began to spiral out of control, where responsibilities came rushing in faster than his ability to carry them, and where silence became more terrifying than any opponent he had ever faced. The body that once made him soar gradually became a burden. His performance was no longer what it used to be, and the mistakes that could not be erased began to reshape the way the world saw him. But what makes Kemp's story not just a tragedy, but a journey worth remembering is that he never completely disappeared. Even though he could not return to his peak, even though he could not fix everything that was lost, he still continued to live, continued to move forward, carrying everything that had happened as an inseparable part of who he was, a testament that sometimes willpower is not in winning, but in not giving up when everything has slipped out of reach. Before we step further into the story, please hit subscribe and leave a like. That is the way you remember a legend who once flew higher than everyone else but still had to learn how to stand firm after falling. Because behind the dunks that shook the entire NBA is a journey where every next step had to be paid for with pain, and we are about to see that right now. If most legends are built from a solid foundation, then Shawn Kemp's childhood began in a space lacking direction, where potential existed but no one really knew how to guide it. Born and raised in Elkhart, he did not face a childhood so harsh that it became tragic, but he also did not have steady hands to hold him back when everything started slipping away too fast. It was a normal environment where kids grew up, played, and found their own way. But for Kemp, nothing was ever truly normal. From a very young age, his body developed far beyond kids. His age taller, stronger, faster, as if he was born to step into a different world. A world that the rest of his life would struggle to understand. But that very superiority created an invisible distance. When you are always the strongest one in the room, you do not learn how to control power. You only learn how to use it. And when no one was strict enough to say stop, no one patient enough to point out boundaries, that power began to become a double-edged sword. For Kemp, basketball came naturally, not as a directed path, but as something he was simply better at than everyone around him. School games were not challenges. They were places where he dominated, where he began to get used to the feeling of winning without needing to understand its cost. No one taught him that talent needed discipline, that power needed control, that success came not only from what you had, but from how you held on to it. Gradually, a way of living took shape, not based on plans or principles, but on instinct and emotion. When things went well, he moved forward without thinking. When he hit obstacles, he reacted in the most natural way, not always the right way. Not because he did not want to do better, but because no one had ever taught him to do differently. And in that absence, Kemp grew up as a person who looked ready for the world on the outside, but inside was still a boy trying to figure out where he truly belonged. The mismatch between body and mind began very early, and it never really went away. As his body grew stronger every day, his mind had not yet caught up to that pace. When the world began to notice him, he still had not learned how to deal with that attention. And when opportunities began to open up, he stepped into them, not with preparation, but with the belief that everything would continue as it always had, that he would always find a way to get through, simply because he was always stronger. But life does not work that way. And the most painful thing is that at that time, no one told him that. Looking back at those years, perhaps it was not what happened that made Shawn Kemp's story heavy, but what did not happen. There was no patient guide to hold him back when necessary. There was no tight enough system to help him understand that talent was not everything. There was no moment that forced him to stop and look at himself before everything became too big to control. And so he grew up faster than the life he was living, carrying a body ready for the biggest stages, but a mind still learning how to stand firm on the ground. That was not an immediate mistake, not a clear fall, but the beginning of a journey where every later step would gradually become harder to balance. A journey where power had taken him very far, but could not show him how to come back. The mismatch between Shawn Kemp's body and mind did not stop at a vague feeling about himself, but gradually began to show in specific choices. Small choices at first, but carrying consequences much larger than a young man could fully understand. While at an age when many other players were slowly building their future through the college path, Kemp took a different direction. Not because he lacked ability, but because he had never really learned how to stop and think about the consequences of what he did. A legal matter happened when he was still very young. One impulsive decision, one thoughtless action, but enough to shake the entire path he could have taken. It was not just a temporary trouble, but the first cut into his future, closing the door to college, which was an important stepping stone for many players before he could even step through. In a world where college is not only a place to hone skills, but also a place where people learn to grow up, learn to take responsibility, and learn to control themselves, losing that opportunity meant Kemp stepped straight into a bigger stage without any protection. He had no time to make small mistakes and correct them in a controlled environment. He had no coaches or tight enough system to hold him back when necessary. Instead, he carried everything he had: talent, power, and lack of control straight into a future where every mistake would be magnified. The impulsive decisions did not stop after that first incident. They began to appear as a natural part of how he lived, not because he deliberately went the wrong way, but because he had never really learned how to distinguish right from wrong in complicated situations. When you grow up without clear boundaries, you do not realize you are crossing lines until you have gone too far. And for Kemp, each step like that did not create an immediate fall, but gradually accumulated into a prolonged state of imbalance. What makes this story heavy is not the mistakes themselves, but the way they quietly became part of who he was. Lack of control was no longer a temporary problem. It became a habit. Choices made quickly, based more on emotion than thought, gradually shaped how he reacted to the world around him. When things went smoothly, that did not cause any clear problem, but when pressure began to appear, when more complicated situations demanded restraint and discipline, what he lacked began to show. At that time, perhaps no one really saw the whole picture. People looked at his talent, at his superior basketball ability, and believed everything else would sort itself out. But life does not work that way. What is not built from the beginning will not naturally appear when needed. And for Kemp, that meant he stepped into the most important phase of his life without the tools necessary to protect himself from his own decisions. There is a terrifying silence in the way these mistakes unfolded. Not loud, not immediately destroying everything, but always present, always waiting. They were like small cracks in a foundation that seemed solid, not big enough to make the whole structure collapse right away, but enough to guarantee that one day, when the weight became too great, everything would not be able to stand firm. And the most painful thing is that at that time, Shawn Kemp still continued moving forward, still believing his talent would be enough to overcome everything, without realizing that what he could not see was what would follow him the longest. After all the silent cracks that had formed earlier, Shawn Kemp's life did not give him extra time to fix or prepare it, pushed him faster, farther, and more dangerously than anything he had ever known. When he was selected by the Seattle SuperSonics in the NBA draft in 1989, it was not just a big step in his career, but a leap straight into a world he had never been taught how to exist in. For many other players, the NBA was a destination after many years of being forged in the college environment, where they learned to control themselves, learned to live with discipline, learned to understand that talent was not everything. But for Kemp, all those stages were almost skipped. He stepped into the harshest league in the world while still carrying the impulsiveness of a boy who had not yet grown up. The change happened almost immediately. From a guy in Elkhart, he stepped into a world where money was no longer a luxury concept, but became part of daily life. The first contracts, the large sums of money, the opportunities opening in every direction all came at once. Too fast, too much, and with no pauses for him to fully understand their meaning. Fame came in the same way. In a short time, the name Shawn Kemp was no longer unfamiliar, but became a face that was mentioned, expected from, and placed in a position he had never imagined. But fame did not only bring recognition, it brought scrutiny, pressure, and temptations that no one had really prepared him to face. In that world, everything was magnified. Success was magnified, but so were mistakes. Decisions that once seemed minor in the past now carried much larger consequences. Choices no longer affected only himself, but began to spread to the life around him. And when there was no solid foundation to rely on, each new pressure was not resolved. It was only carried along, accumulated, waiting for a moment to reveal itself. Kemp did not lack willpower, did not lack effort, but he lacked something more important: the ability to control what was happening to him. Adaptation, something many people take for granted, became a silent battle for him. When everything changed too fast, you do not have time to adjust, you can only react. And when reactions are driven by emotion rather than understanding, the steps begin to become unsteady. There were nights when silence became heavier than any sound on the court, moments when he had to face the reality that this new life was unlike anything he had ever known, and there was no one standing beside him to show him how to move forward. The painful part was not that he entered the NBA too early, but that he entered it alone, carrying everything he had: talent, power, and lack of preparation. People around him saw the potential, saw the ability to create great moments, but few saw the fragility behind all of that. And in an environment that operated at high speed, where there was no room for slowing down or weakness, that fragility did not disappear, it was only hidden. Gradually, Shawn Kemp began to live in a world far beyond his ability to control. Not because he did not want to control it, but because he had never really been taught how to do so. Each day that passed, the gap between the person he was inside and the image the world saw grew larger. On the court, he began to show signs of a rising star, powerful, explosive, unstoppable. But off the court, his life began to become more complicated, harder to grasp, and increasingly distant from any stable structure. There was no specific moment that marked that loss of control. It did not come as a sudden fall, but as a slow current, pulling him little by little. And the scariest thing was that while all of that was happening, Shawn Kemp still continued moving forward, still playing ball, still competing, still delivering moments that made the whole world stand up. But deep inside, Something had begun to change imbalance he could not yet name, but that would follow him through the years afterward, when everything was no longer as simple as jumping higher than everyone else. And then, while the cracks inside still silently existed, Shawn Kemp began to explode in a way no one could stop, fast, fierce, and almost impossible to explain. On the court, everything seemed to become simple for him, in a way that life outside had never allowed. When the ball was thrown into the air, when his feet left the ground, all the chaos, all the feeling of being lost seemed to disappear, giving way to a perfect moment where he controlled everything. His dunks were not just technique, but a release of raw, direct energy that made the entire arena hold its breath before exploding in sound. In a short time, Kemp went from a young player to one of the most talked-about names in the NBA, not because he played safely or calculatedly, but because he brought something people could not predict, a feeling that anything could happen when he had the ball. The alley-oops, the leaps that defied every limit. The times he slammed the ball over opponents' heads as if they did not exist, all gradually became his trademark. People did not just watch him to follow the game. They watched him to feel something more intense, an emotion that only special players could create. Along with that explosion came growing confidence with every game, every season. When you are constantly praised, constantly seeing yourself do what others cannot, a belief begins to form that you cannot be stopped, that you can always find a way, that what happened in the past no longer matters. For Kemp, that feeling was not just confidence, but gradually became an almost invincible state. He stepped into every game believing he would do something no one had done before. And most of the time, he actually did. But that very explosion also brought something else attention. Kemp was no longer a rising name. He became the center of eyes, of expectations, of stories that the media and fans began to build around him. Every game was not just a chance to play well, but a stage where he was expected to keep shocking, to keep doing something bigger, stronger, crazier. And when you live in a world where every day is measured by the level of explosion, you begin to forget how to exist in normalcy. Kemp's life gradually revolved around momentary moments, dunks, cheers, emotions surging in a few short seconds. It was a pace of life with no quiet spaces, no time to stop and think, no room to look back at himself. Each victory pushed him further into that state, where everything was decided by immediate emotion, where the present was always bigger than anything else. And while that made him unstoppable on the court, it also quietly pulled him away from any form of control in his personal life. No one could deny that those years were the time when Shawn Kemp became great. He did not just play basketball. He changed the way people looked at his position, at the limits of the human body, at what could happen in an NBA game. But hidden beneath that greatness was an increasingly unbalanced pace of life, where everything was built on emotion rather than structure, on energy rather than discipline. When things went well, that did not cause any clear problem. But life is not always favorable, and when challenges began to appear, what was not built from the beginning began to show. There is a terrifying silence hidden behind all that noise. When the game ended, when the crowd left, when the lights went out, the moments when Kemp had to face himself became longer, heavier. There were no more dunks to release energy, no more cheers to cover thoughts, only a void that he had never really learned how to fill. And in that void, what he carried from before, the lack of control, the impulsive decisions, the unhealed cracks, began to have space to exist more clearly. What makes this phase painful is not the lack of greatness, but that the greatness came too fast, too big, and without what was necessary to hold it. Kemp had reached the peak, but he had never really been prepared to live there. And while the whole world looked up to him as a symbol of power and dominance, few realized that underneath it all, he was still learning how to understand himself, a lesson that life did not give him enough time to complete before other things began to fall apart. Shawn Kemp's explosion did not stop at individual moments, but quickly became part of something bigger, a collective, a force, a team carrying enough energy to make the entire NBA hesitate. When he teamed up with Gary Payton in the Seattle SuperSonics jersey, everything was no longer just spectacular plays, but a system operating with speed and power that left opponents unable to react. Payton controlled the pace of the game, while Kemp finished it with slams carrying all the energy of a man who knew no limits. They did not just play together, they complemented each other in an almost perfect way, turning every combination into a statement that this team not only wanted to win, but wanted to dominate. The Seattle SuperSonics went from a strong team to one of the top contenders for the championship. With each season that passed, the expectations placed on their shoulders grew larger, and Kemp, at the center of it all, became the symbol of that ambition. He was no longer just an explosive young player. He was one of the faces representing the future of the league, a name mentioned in conversations about those who could change the NBA landscape. Victories came one after another, games where they overwhelmed opponents, moments when the whole team operated like a perfect machine, all creating the feeling that they were getting very close to the peak every team craved. Along with that success, fame and money came just as fast. Bigger contracts, opportunities off the court, doors opening in every direction. Kemp's life began to change not just in degree, but in nature. He was no longer the guy from Elkhart trying to find his way, but a star living in a world where everything seemed achievable with just one decision. But right here, something began to change in a way that was hard to notice. When things became easier on the outside, what was inside began to become more complicated. Kemp's personal life could no longer maintain the simplicity it once had. Relationships began to appear more frequently, more deeply, but also harder to control. Responsibilities were no longer just about playing well, but gradually expanded to aspects he had never really prepared to face. Decisions no longer affected only himself, but began to involve many other people, many other lives, and when everything developed faster than his ability to manage, the imbalance began to form silently. On the court, he continued to soar, continued to deliver moments that made the whole world stand up. But off the court, his pace of life began to become more chaotic, harder to control. When you live in a world where immediate emotion is always placed first, where every day is measured by the level of explosion, you begin to lose the ability to look beyond the present. And when the present becomes everything, what needs to be built for the future is often left behind. There was no clear warning sign that everything was beginning to veer off course. There was no specific moment people could point to and say that was when everything changed. Instead, the imbalance came slowly, creeping through every decision, every choice, every day that passed. It was not big enough to cause an immediate collapse, but enough to create a growing gap between Kemp the player on the court and Kemp in real life. What makes this phase painful is not the lack of success, but the excess of it. Everything came too much, too fast, and with no time to be fully understood. Kemp continued to move forward, continued to compete, continued to become one of the most feared players in the league. But at the same time, he also began to carry more pressure, responsibilities, complicated relationships, without any system strong enough to hold it all together. There is something in the way everything unfolded that made people unable to immediately recognize its seriousness. Because from the outside, everything still looked perfect. The team was winning, Kemp was playing well, fame continued to grow. But deep inside, what was not built from the beginning began to create gaps that no victory could fill. And in those gaps, the imbalance continued to grow, slowly but surely, like a current that no one really noticed until it had swept away too much. Shawn Kemp, at that time, was still a legend being written day by day. But at the same time, he was also a man gradually stepping into a phase where everything would no longer be as simple as jumping higher than the opponent. Success was still there, bright and dazzling, but beneath it, Something had begun to change, a shift that no one could stop, not even himself. The peak that Shawn Kemp reached did not come slowly. It came like a big wave that swept him up, lifted him higher than anything he had ever imagined, and held him there long enough for the whole world to believe he belonged there. When the Seattle SuperSonics advanced to the 1996 NBA Finals, it was not just a team's success, but the moment when everything Kemp had become converged. On the court, he did not flinch against the greatest opponent, Michael Jordan, but instead played with an energy that made people stop and see him as one of the best players of that time. The scoring plays, the dunks, the moments he dominated the opposing defense all created the image of a man who was not just present in the biggest game, but truly belonged in it. At that time, Shawn Kemp was no longer just a phenomenon. He was one of the most prominent faces in the NBA. His name appeared in every discussion. His image appeared everywhere. And every time he stepped onto the court, the expectation that came with him was no longer whether he would play well, but what he would create next. When you reach a point where the world no longer doubts your ability, but only waits for you to do something bigger, you begin to live at a pace that very few can sustain for long. And that was exactly where everything began to become hard to balance. Because while Kemp could control the game, could dominate opponents, he could not find a way to control his life off the court. There was no clear boundary between competing and personal life. Everything blended together, pulling him into a vortex with no stopping point. Game days, practices, trips, nights after games all happened at such a high speed that there was no room for quiet. And when there is no quiet, you have no chance to look back, to adjust, to realize that you are veering off course. Kemp continued to live at that pace, not because he wanted to lose control, but because he had never really learned how to stop. When you have gotten used to everything always happening fast, always happening strong, slowing down is not a natural choice. It requires an awareness he had never built, and so he continued to move forward, continued to push himself farther, continued to live in a state where each day was defined by its intensity. But off the court, pressure began to accumulate in ways that no dunk could release. Personal relationships became more complicated, responsibilities became more numerous, expectations came not only from fans, but also from those around him. Every decision now was no longer as simple as before. It carried bigger, deeper, and longer-lasting consequences. But in a life with no pauses, those decisions were still made quickly, based on the emotion of the moment rather than the consideration of a long-term vision. What makes this phase heavy is not the lack of awareness, but the lack of distance for awareness to appear. When you are always in the noise, you do not hear what is happening inside yourself. When you are always being pulled forward, you do not realize what you are leaving behind. And for Kemp, what he began to leave behind was not only balance, but the very ability to control his own life. There were moments, very rare, when everything slowed down enough for him to feel that heaviness. After a game, when the locker room became quiet, when the lights were no longer shining on him, when no one was calling his name anymore. Those were the times when the void appeared. But instead of stopping and facing it, he continued to move forward, returning to the familiar pace where everything was faster, bigger, and did not allow those thoughts to exist for too long. The world looked at Shawn Kemp and saw a star at his peak, a man who had achieved what millions could only dream of. But few realized that this very peak was also the beginning of another journey. A journey no longer measured by points or victories, but by the ability to hold himself steady amid everything that was happening. And in that journey, Kemp did not stop, not because he did not want to, but because he did not know how to do it. The cheers still rang out every time he competed. The dunks still made the entire arena explode. But deep inside, something had begun to change an imbalance that no one could see from the outside. And the scariest thing was that while the whole world was cheering him on to move forward, no one told him that sometimes the most important thing is not to move faster, but to know when to stop. And then, while the world continued to see Shawn Kemp as a symbol of power and dominance, another story began to unfold in parallel, more quietly, more complicatedly, and increasingly harder to control. It was no longer just games, dunks, or explosive moments on the court. His life off the court began to expand in a way that no game schedule could measure. Personal relationships appeared quickly, without a clear order, without time to build a solid foundation, and without quiet spaces to fully understand their meaning. In a world where everything happened fast, where emotions were pushed to the highest and every opportunity seemed to need to be seized immediately, Kemp's relationships also developed at that pace. They came as natural reactions of a life full of energy, but lacked the stability necessary to last. Not because he did not want connection, but because he had never really had the chance to learn how to maintain it. When everything in life is built on moments, things that need time and patience are often left behind. Then, responsibilities began to appear, not little by little, but rushing in, overlapping, and hard to control. Becoming a father did not come to Kemp as a prepared journey, but as a sudden reality he had to face while still trying to keep balance in his own life. Children appeared in his life, bringing affection, but also financial and emotional responsibilities. He had never been taught how to carry. Without a stable family structure to rely on, without a strong enough support system to share the burden, everything gradually became a complicated network he had to handle by himself. Kemp's private life began to become heavy in a way no one in the stands could see. When you stand on the court, everything is simplified. There are rules, there are goals, there are clear results. But off the court, there are no such boundaries. There is no referee to blow the whistle when you go too far, no timeout for you to catch your breath. And in a life without structure, where relationships, responsibilities, and pressure intertwine, keeping everything under control becomes an almost impossible task. The most painful thing is that from the outside, everything still looked like it was going normally. Kemp was still competing, still delivering moments that made fans stand up, still part of a strong team. But inside, his life was becoming increasingly complicated, like an equation with too many variables and no clear solution. Decisions made in the past began to have a clearer impact, no longer isolated moments, but a connected chain creating prolonged pressure. The lack of family stability meant there was no real place to return to. There was no clear foundation, no space where he could let go of everything and simply be himself. And when you have no place to stop, you continue moving, continue running at the pace you have gotten used to. Even when that begins to exhaust you, Kemp continued to live that way, not because he did not notice the heaviness accumulating, but because he did not know how to get out of it. Personal pressure began to seep into his career in subtle but clear ways. What happened off the court was no longer completely separate from what happened on the court. The mind was no longer fully focused. Energy was no longer distributed naturally as before. When you carry too much inside, you cannot maintain the lightness needed to soar as before. And for Kemp, who had built his entire career on explosion and freedom, any heaviness could create a difference. The early signs were not too clear, but they were there in the way he moved, in moments that were a beat slower, in decisions on the court that were no longer as sharp as before. Not because he lost talent, but because he began to carry too much that talent could not solve. And the sad thing is that while everything outside became increasingly complicated, his pace of life still did not change. He continued to move forward, continued to compete, continued to live in a world that did not allow stopping. There is a painful contradiction in this phase. On one hand, Shawn Kemp was living the dream that so many people crave: fame, money, recognition. On the other hand, he was gradually losing the simplicity a person needs to stay balanced. When everything in life begins to multiply beyond control, you do not always realize it right away. Sometimes you only realize it when you have gone too far, when everything has become too complicated to return to the starting point. And for Kemp, Life was no longer just basketball. It became a web of responsibilities, relationships, and pressures he had to carry every day. He was still the person the world saw, strong, explosive, unstoppable. But inside, he began to become a different person, a man, trying to hold everything together while it was gradually slipping out of his hands. And while no one could see the whole picture, it continued to exist, continued to grow, waiting for a moment when it could no longer be hidden by dunks or cheers. And then, after all the cheers, the dunks that shook the entire arena, after the nights when the name Shawn Kemp was chanted like an irreplaceable icon, there were moments when everything stopped. No lights, no cheers, no anything to cover the void that was gradually opening inside him. When he was no longer on the court, when the game ended and everyone left, Kemp had to face a reality he had never really prepared for, facing himself in the silence. On the court, everything was always clear. There were goals, there were roles. There was a version of him that the whole world understood. Strong, explosive, unstoppable. But off the court, when those elements disappeared, he began to realize that he no longer knew exactly who he was without basketball. When you spend your whole life becoming something, and you do it better than most people, you rarely stop to ask yourself what will happen if one day you are no longer that thing. And for Kemp, that question did not come as a passing thought, it came as a growing void, a disorientation he could not easily fill. The feeling of being lost did not come immediately, but crept into every small moment. At first, it was just short periods after games when the energy was still in his body but had nowhere to release. Then, gradually, it became longer evenings, longer silences, where he could no longer rely on the familiar pace to avoid thinking. And when those thoughts began to appear, they were not simple, they were not easy questions to answer, but deeper things about who he was, about the life he was living, about what was gradually slipping out of his hands. Finding an identity outside the role of a player became much harder than he could have imagined. On the court, he knew exactly what he had to do, but off the court, there was no clear script for him to follow. There was no one to show him how to be a stable father, a man who could maintain relationships, a person who could exist without needing cheers to feel valuable. And in that absence, Kemp continued to return to the only thing he knew: pace, emotion, explosion. Even when those things no longer fit with life off the court, psychological pressure began to increase over time, not because of a specific event, but because of the accumulation of everything that had not been resolved. Personal responsibilities, complicated relationships, expectations from outside and from himself all gradually piled up, forming a burden he had to carry every day. But unlike on the court, where he could face pressure with power and speed, these pressures had no clear shape. They could not be overcome with a leap or a decisive play. They existed inside, silently but constantly, keeping him from ever truly feeling relief. Isolation began to appear not because he was separated from people, but because he gradually felt that no one really understood what he was going through. When you live in a world where people only see the best version of you, they have a hard time recognizing when you start struggling. And when you do not know how to express those struggles, you begin to keep them to yourself. Kemp was still among people, still participating in activities, still maintaining relationships, but inside, he began to feel increasingly distant. There were nights when the silence became so heavy that he had to find ways to fill it, not with understanding, but with anything that could keep him from facing it for too long. And in those moments, decisions were made not because they were right, but because they brought a temporary feeling, a short release from thoughts he did not know how to handle. But temporary solutions never solve long-term problems. They only push it to another time when it returns with greater intensity. What makes this phase especially painful is the contrast between what the world saw and what he was going through. For fans, Shawn Kemp was still a big name, a player worth watching, a symbol of an era. But for him, life began to become more confusing, heavier, and increasingly far from the feeling of control he once had on the court. There was no single moment that marked the complete change. There was no specific event that made everything collapse. Instead, it was a process, slow, silent, but continuous. Each day that passed, the disorientation grew a little more. The pressure grew a little more. The distance between him and himself grew a little more. And before he realized it, his life was no longer a series of explosive moments, but a journey searching for something he had never truly had, a feeling of stability, a foundation, a version of himself that existed without needing to rely on the cheers of the crowd. The silence that Shawn Kemp began to face in the moments off the court did not stop at his mind. It gradually spread to his body, where it had once been his greatest source of power, where it had once made him fly higher than anyone, now beginning to change in a way he could not control. There was no specific day that marked that shift. There was no fall or major injury that forced him to stop. Instead, it came slowly, almost unnoticeable at first, but clear enough that when he looked back, everything had become very different. The body that had once been Kemp's most fearsome weapon, fast, strong, explosive, began to lose its sharpness. His steps were no longer as light as before. His leaps no longer reached the heights he had once taken for granted. And the scariest thing was that he still tried to play the old way, still tried to live in the memory of a version his body could no longer maintain. Weight gain did not happen overnight, but it accumulated through each day, each habit, each choice he did not realize was changing him. When you have gotten used to your body always meeting every demand, you do not think that one day it will no longer be able to do so. The loss of peak physical condition was not just a matter of appearance. It was a shock to the way he understood himself. For Kemp, his identity was tied to the ability to fly, to explode, to do things others could not. When those elements began to decline, it was not only performance that was affected, but the sense of self also began to waver. On the court, he still tried to execute the plays that had once made his name, but the results were no longer the same. A slower step, a lower jump, a moment of hesitation, those seemingly small things were enough to change the entire outcome of a play. His playing performance began to decline in a way no one could deny. The numbers were no longer as impressive as before. The explosive moments became rarer. The games he once dominated now became games where he had to struggle to keep up with the pace. And in a league like the NBA, where everything always moves forward, where younger, faster, stronger players continuously appear, slowing down even just a little was enough to create a gap. But the most painful thing was not that change, but the way Kemp had to go through it. There was no gentle transition. There was no time to adapt. He did not just lose part of his physical ability. He lost what had defined his entire way of playing basketball. And when his body could no longer support the old playing style, he not only had to change how he competed, he had to change how he saw himself. But that was not easy, especially when you had spent your whole life building a specific version of yourself. The physical change brought a profound psychological change. When you can no longer do what you once did, you begin to doubt yourself. Moments of hesitation appear, not because you do not want to, but because you are no longer sure you can. The confidence that once came naturally now had to be searched for. And it was not always possible to find. For Kemp, it was like standing on the court without feeling he belonged there the way he used to. Pressure from the outside did not decrease when performance declined. It only changed shape. Fans began to compare him with himself in the past. What was once considered normal now became hard to achieve. And while people looked at that change and asked questions, Kemp had to live in it every day, had to feel every difference, every new limit his body imposed. There is a special kind of loneliness in that process. No one can truly understand the feeling of losing something that had once been part of you. No one can exactly feel the difference between flying up easily and having to try hard to reach even part of that. And while everything continued, games still happened. Seasons still went on. Kemp had to find a way to adapt to a reality he never wanted. But the hardest thing was not the change of the body, but accepting it. Accepting that you are no longer the person you once were. Accepting that what once came naturally now requires effort. And sometimes it is still not enough. For a man who had once flown higher than everyone, feeling the ground became heavier than ever. And through all of that, Shawn Kemp still continued to compete, still continued to step onto the court, still tried to hold on to what was left of himself. But deep inside, he began to understand that his greatest battle was no longer with the opponent across the court. It was with time, with his body, and with himself, a battle that no dunk could win, and no cheers could cover. The change in Shawn Kemp's body was not the end of the story. It was only the first sign that something bigger was happening, a process with no loud noise, no clear moment of collapse, but deep enough to change the entire direction of his life. What began inside, from the feeling of being lost, from the imbalance, now began to spread outside, touching every aspect of his life. Personal problems did not disappear over time. They accumulated, little by little, through each day, each decision, each moment. He did not stop to face himself. The pressures he had carried from before, family, responsibilities, expectations, did not decrease, but instead became heavier when left unresolved. And when pressure has no outlet, people often turn to other ways to ease it, even if only temporarily. For Kemp, those choices were not always the right ones, but in the moments when everything became too heavy, they seemed like the only way to continue. Involvement with substances did not come as a planned decision, but as a reaction, a way to fill the void, to soothe the thoughts he could not control. But temporary solutions always carry long-term consequences. They not only affected his body but also brought legal troubles, problems that could not be solved with a game or a season. When these elements began to appear, they did not stand alone. They connected with each other, forming a complicated web that he found increasingly hard to escape. Kemp's career did not collapse in a single moment. There was no one gain that marked the end, no injury that forced him to stop completely. Instead, it was a gradual decline, a process where each day that passed he felt himself a little farther from his best version. The games he once dominated now became games where he had to struggle to keep the pace. The explosive moments became rare, and when they appeared, they were no longer enough to cover the long stretches where he was no longer himself. In a team, the role is not fixed. It changes according to performance, according to needs, according to what you can bring in the present, not the past. And when Kemp could no longer hold on to what had once made his name, his position also began to change. He was no longer the center of every strategy, no longer the one all eyes turned to. He gradually stepped back, not because he wanted to, but because reality forced him to. That did not happen overnight. It happened through each game, each coaching decision, each moment when he was no longer the first choice. Losing the role was not just a change in position. It was a change in how he saw himself. When you have gotten used to being the center, becoming a smaller part of the picture is hard to accept, not because you do not want to contribute, but because you still clearly remember who you once were. And that memory, instead of becoming motivation, sometimes became a burden, reminding you of the gap between the past and the present. Kemp tried to come back, tried to regain his form, tried to become the version he once was. But his body was no longer the same. His mind was no longer the same, and the circumstances around him were no longer the same. What he faced was not only competition from other players, but time itself. What he had been through, the choices he could not change. And in that battle, effort was not always enough. What makes this phase especially painful is that there was no clear stopping point. There was no moment he could look back on and say that was when everything ended. Instead, it was like standing on a slope where you do not realize you are sliding down until you are already too far from the starting point. Each day that passed, the change was small enough to be hard to notice, but when looking back, the whole picture had changed. Shawn Kemp did not disappear from the NBA in a fall. He faded, and in that process, he was still himself in some way, still competing, still appearing, still trying. But the version the world once knew, the version that flew higher than everyone, the version that made people stand up, gradually became a memory. And the most painful thing was not that he could not return, but that he still tried, still kept going. While deep inside he began to understand that there are things that, once lost, will never come back the way they were. The fading of Shawn Kemp did not end with a clear farewell, but continued into another phase, where he was still present in the NBA, but no longer belonged to it the way he used to. When he left the Seattle SuperSonics, the place that had once been his biggest stage, Kemp stepped into new chapters in his career with the Cleveland Cavaliers and then the Portland Trail Blazers. But these chapters no longer carried the feeling of explosion or hope as before. They were like prolonged efforts to extend a story that had begun to reach its conclusion, where he still competed, still appeared, but was no longer the center of anything. In Cleveland, then Portland, Kemp was no longer the name around which every strategy revolved. He was no longer the one given the power to decide games, no longer the focus of every gaze. Instead, he became a part of the system, an option in the lineup, a name carrying more past than present. That was not a denial of his talent, but a reflection of a reality. The NBA always operates on the league. It does not wait for anyone. When you are no longer at your peak, no matter who you once were, your role changes. And while Kemp tried to adapt to the new role, the NBA continued to move forward at undiminished speed. New generations of players appeared, faster, more disciplined, better prepared. Playing styles changed, strategies developed, and what had once made Kemp different gradually became less fitting in the new context. The painful part was not that he was no longer the best, but that he had to watch the very thing that had once been his gradually become the past. Adaptation was never easy, especially when it required you to let go of a part of yourself that you had built over many years. For Kemp, accepting that he was no longer the center, that he had to play differently, was not just a technical adjustment. It was a change in identity. But when your identity is tied to a version you can no longer maintain, finding a new version becomes a difficult journey. The games continue to happen, the seasons continue to pass, but the gap between the past and the present became increasingly clear. There were moments, very rare, when Kemp still showed signs of the old man, a powerful play, an emotional finish short, flashes of a time that had passed, but they were no longer enough to change the overall picture. They were like memories coming alive for a few seconds before reality returned with all its weight. What makes this phase especially heavy is the gradual realization. It was not a shock, not a sudden moment, but a process where Kemp began to understand that he could not go back, that no matter how hard he tried, how much he wanted it, how strong the memories of what he had once done were, reality was still something that could not be changed. And having to live with that truth, day after day, was a challenge no game could have prepared him for. There is a special kind of sadness in still being present, but no longer belonging to the place where you were once the center. Kemp was still there, still wearing the uniform, still stepping onto the court, but the feeling was no longer the same. It was no longer the place where he could freely fly, no longer the place where he could define the game. Instead, it became a place where he had to adapt, had to accept, had to find a way to exist in a smaller role. And while he was trying to do that, the NBA did not stop to wait for him to catch up. The league continued to advance, carrying new names, new stories, new moments. What Kemp had once created was not forgotten, but it gradually became part of history rather than the present. And for a person who had once lived in that present, Watching it pass without being able to hold on to it was not an easy experience. The gap between the man he once was and the man he was becoming was not only measured by performance, but by feeling. One side was the memory of explosion, of dunks that made the whole world stand up. The other side was the reality where he had to find ways to contribute differently, where each game was no longer a stage to shine, but a test of adaptation. And between those two things, Shawn Kemp continued to move forward, not with the certainty of someone advancing, but with the persistence of someone trying not to be left behind. And then there came a time when even effort was no longer enough to keep Shawn Kemp in the pace he once belonged to, and his journey in the NBA ended not with a brilliant moment, but with a quietness that almost no one noticed. There was no bid farewell game, no stage where everyone stood up to say goodbye, just a day when he no longer stepped onto the court. A day when the lights no longer shone on him the way they used to. After all those years of living in cheers, leaving the court was not just a career change, but a profound shift in the way he existed. Returning to Seattle, the place that had once been home, the place where he had reached his peak, Kemp's life became quiet in a way he had never really gotten used to. There were no more game schedules, no more constant flights, no more intense practices or nights competing in front of tens of thousands of people. Instead, there were long days without clear structure, mornings without specific goals, and a void he had to fill by himself. For many people, the quiet could bring peace, but for Kemp, who had lived too long in sound, in speed, in intensity, that quiet became heavier than any noise he had ever experienced. When there was no longer basketball to occupy his mind, what he had carried from before began to appear more clearly. The choices, the mistakes, the complicated relationships, the responsibilities that had never been resolved all did not disappear when he left the NBA. On the contrary, they became clearer in the silence. There were no more games to distract his thoughts, no more cheers to cover his emotions, and Kemp was forced to face the consequences of the years that had passed. Little by little, life no longer revolved around competing, but that did not mean it became easier. There was no longer public attention, no more big headlines, no more eyes following every step a part of him. The part that had been nourished by that recognition gradually had to learn how to exist without it. This was not a complete loss of fame, but a change in the way that fame existed. From a vivid present, it became a memory, something people mentioned but no longer witnessed directly. There were days when Kemp could look back at what he had done and feel pride, those dunks, those gains, those moments when he had truly touched the peak. But there were also days when that memory became heavy, when he realized that those things no longer belonged to the present. When you have once lived in a place where everything was bigger, faster, stronger, returning to a normal life is not an easy process. It requires acceptance not only that what has passed will not return, but that you have to find a way to keep living without relying on it. What had been lost was not only performance or position in the NBA, but also the sense of self he once had. On the court, he knew who he was, but in life after retirement, that question no longer had as clear an answer as before. And while he continued to live, continued to move forward, that question remained there, not always answered, but always present. The silence after the roar of the crowd was not a sudden end, it was a prolonged state where each day that passed carried a different feeling. There were lighter days when he could find stability in small things, but there were also days when the past came back more clearly, when the gap between what once was and what now existed became hard to accept. And through all of that, Shawn Kemp still continued to live. Not as a legend at his peak, not as a star the whole world watched, but as a man learning how to exist in the truth of himself. He carried memories of what he had achieved, but also carried what he had lost. And in that quiet, his story did not end it, only shifted into a different form, less noisy, but no less heavy. The quiet after leaving the court did not bring any miracle for Shawn Kemp. There was no awakening moment that made everything clear, and there was no complete recovery journey like the stories people often want to believe. His life, after the lights, did not follow a straight upward line, but was like a chain of days passing by, where each step carried everything that had happened before, inseparable and impossible to erase. There was no complete change, no perfect new version, only a man who continued to exist, even knowing he was no longer the person who once flew high. Kemp still lived, and that, in a way, was an effort greater than any dunk he had ever made, because living in a life without glamour, without constant recognition, without those moments you could rely on to feel valuable, requires a different kind of strength, a kind of strength no one can see. The wounds he carried did not disappear with time. They remained there, in memories, in past decisions, in relationships that could not return to the way they once were. But instead of trying to fix everything, Kemp gradually learned how to live with them. Normal life, something many people take for granted, became a challenge for him. With no more game schedules, no more clear daily goals, he had to find a way to build a new rhythm of life, a rhythm not based on intensity, but on stability. That was not easy, because for many years he had gotten used to everything always happening at the highest level, always demanding the most, always bringing the strongest emotions. When all of that disappeared, the remaining void was not always easy to fill. There were times when Kemp tried to find a part of his old self getting involved in business, appearing at events, keeping some connection with the world he once belonged to. But those efforts were not aimed at returning to the peak, but simply at keeping life moving forward. He no longer chased the lights, no longer tried to prove anything to the world. Instead, he began to accept that there were things that could not be changed, that some chapters had closed, and the only thing he could do was continue writing the rest of the story in the way he could. That acceptance did not come in a single day. It was not a decision, but a process. There were days when the past still rose clearly, when he remembered what he once was, once did, once achieved. There were days when the comparison between the past and the present became uncomfortable, when the gap between the two seemed too large. But then, little by little, he learned to look at what he had instead of only what he had lost. Not to forget the past, but so it would not pull him back for too long. What makes this journey remarkable is not that Kemp changed completely, but that he did not give up. He did not disappear, did not abandon life, did not stop at what had happened. Even without the glamour, even without the cheers, he still continued to move forward, still existed, still found a way to live in a world that no longer revolved around him. And sometimes that very thing carried more meaning than any title, because it was not given, not widely recognized, but demanded more than anything he had ever done on the court. Shawn Kemp could not fix everything that had happened. He could not go back to change the decisions, could not erase the mistakes, could not restore what had been lost. But he still lived, still continued, still carried it all as a part of who he was. And in a world that always seeks perfect stories, his story carried a different truth, that sometimes life is not about fixing everything but about accepting it and still moving forward, even when the road ahead is no longer as bright as before. And then, when looking back at Shawn Kemp's entire journey from a boy growing up in Elkhart with a superior body but a life not yet shaped, to an explosive star in the Seattle SuperSonics jersey, and finally, a man quietly walking forward after the lights had gone out, people cannot tell that story with just one word. It is not only success, nor is it only failure. It is a journey carrying both, intertwined, overlapping, inseparable. There were phases in Kemp's life when everything seemed so perfect it was hard to believe. The dunks that made entire arenas stand up, the games where he dominated every opponent, the seasons when he was seen as one of the most feared players in the NBA, all of that was not imagination, but reality. He had truly reached a peak that not many people could touch, had left a mark that time could not erase. Those moments are still there, in fans' memories, in highlight reels, in the way people mention him whenever they talk about the most explosive players who ever existed. But his story did not stop at those moments. It continued, going through upheavals, mistakes, choices he could not change. What happened off the court was not separate parts from his career. They were part of it. The complicated relationships, the personal pressures, the periods of losing control, the times he could not return to his old form all created a fuller picture of who he was. And in that picture, there was no clear line between light and darkness. What makes Shawn Kemp's legacy special is not that he was perfect, but that he was a real human being. A man who went through things many people did not see, who lived at a pace not everyone could understand, and who had to face consequences there was no way to avoid. He could not keep everything. Not the peak performance forever, not control in every aspect of life, not a straight upward path like many once expected, but that did not diminish what he had achieved. On the contrary, it made his story closer, truer, and perhaps more heartbreaking, because in the world of sports, people often look for stories of perfection, of men who overcome everything and end at the peak. But life does not always work that way, and Kemp, in his own way, showed a different image of man who could reach the peak but still had to struggle to hold on to himself. The upheavals did not erase the achievements, and the achievements did not erase the upheavals. Both existed side by side, creating a legacy not only measured by all-star selections or big games, but also by the way he lived, faced things, and continued to move forward even when everything was no longer the same. He may not have become the perfect role model many expected, but he became a story people cannot forget, a story about greatness, but also about the limits of being human. And perhaps that is exactly what keeps Shawn Kemp remembered. Not only for what he did on the court, but for his entire journey, a journey that was not whole, not perfect, but real. A journey that shows that sometimes achieving everything does not mean keeping everything. And that in life, there are things even the strongest people cannot hold on to forever. But even so, he is still here. Not as an unbeatable icon, but as a man who has been through it all: glory, loss, mistakes, and acceptance. And in that existence, in the fact that he still continues to live and move forward, his legacy lies not only in the dunks that shook the entire NBA, but also in the man himself, a person who once flew higher than everyone, but also had to learn how to stand firm when he could no longer fly. The story of Shawn Kemp does not only make people feel regret, but also leaves a very deep ache, because he did not lack talent, did not lack opportunities, but lacked the most important thing: a solid enough foundation to hold on to everything that came too fast. When looking back at his journey, from the dunks that shook the NBA in the Seattle SuperSonics jersey, the NBA Finals against Michael Jordan, to the years afterward when his body gained weight, his performance declined, and his personal life became complicated with many family responsibilities, people cannot simply say it was a simple downfall. It was a chain of accumulated consequences, beginning from a youth without direction in Elkhart, continuing with stepping into the NBA too early without mental preparation, then gradually losing control in the face of fame, money, and pressure. The most painful thing is that his collapse did not happen in a single moment, but unfolded slowly, like the way he faded from the very position he once dominated. But it is also precisely in that incompleteness that Shawn Kemp becomes worthy of honor. Because he did not disappear. He still continued to live, still existed, still carried everything that had happened as a part of who he was. And that is the profound lesson for American society. Success is not only about reaching the peak, but about the ability to maintain and control yourself once you're there. Talent without discipline and preparation will become a burden. And finally, the value of a person lies not only in what they achieve, but in the way they continue to move forward when everything has slipped out of reach. If the story of Shawn Kemp makes you think, Please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to honor a man who once flew higher than everyone but still never stopped moving forward when life pulled him back to the ground. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the halo that not everyone is strong enough to tell.